Thank you for having me, and thanks to everybody for coming out. And unless anybody has any questions, let's get started. Good Saturday afternoon to you, wherever you may be. It's time to finally say those magic words. It's time for expansion baseball. Now, as Jesse mentioned, can anybody see the book? Does anybody see it?
For me, it's pixelating.
Yeah,
So I really can't see
I
it.
can see it occasionally.
All right. Anyways, for those who can't see, I'm holding up a copy of the book. It's a green book, and you can get it through the SABR website or through, I believe Amazon still has copies. I believe the Canadian Baseball Hall of Fame still has copies. The book came out in 2018. Bill Nallon and I were the co-editors. Thank you for singing its praises, Jesse. And let's continue. So what I'm doing today is I'm going to answer the question, which of the 14 Major League Baseball expansion drafts was the most successful? So let's just review the teams first of all. 1961, there were two expansion teams, the Los Angeles Angels and the Washington Senators. And then in 1962, there were two more, the Houston Colt 45s and the New York Mets. The first round of expansion.
Hello?
What's that?
She's muted now.
Oh, the first round of expansion was a natural conclusion to the failure of the Continental League. It's four cities that didn't have teams before. Houston, the Twin Cities, a second team in New York, and a second team in LA were given franchises. And the reason why 1961 went first was to give a second American League team to Washington, D.C. after losing the Twins to Minnesota. The next round, two of those teams changed their names in the 60s. The Colt 45 became the Astros, and the Los Angeles Angels became the California Angels. Then in 1967, the Kansas City Athletics moved to Oakland. The state of Missouri files an antitrust lawsuit against the American League if Kansas City is not given a replacement team by 1971. So we have a second round of expansion in 1969. The Kansas City Royals and the Seattle Pilots. The American League has 12 teams, so now the National League wants 12 teams as well. So we get San Diego and Montreal. But then in 1970, the Pilots moved to Milwaukee. And 2 years later, the Washington Senators to the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. State of Washington threatens to file an antitrust lawsuit as well if Seattle does not get another team by 1976. Consequently, we have another round of expansion, but this is the American League only. That was Seattle Mariners and the Toronto Blue Jays. The National League voted against expansion. 1993, we have another round, one team per league, and that was as part of the 1985 basic new agreement. Then in 1998, we have one final round of expansion, and that is to pay for the collusion lawsuit. Pat Gillick once remarked that he would expect an expansion team to take 10 years to evolve into a contender. Gillick oversaw the early years of two expansion teams, the Houston Colt 45s and the Toronto Blue Jays. And to answer my question, we're going to be using three different metrics. How well did each of the expansion teams perform in their first decade in the major leagues? How well do the players selected in the expansion drafts contribute to their teams? And question number 3, how effective was the statistical output of the expansion players in the first decade of each franchise? And this question will be answered using wins above replacement. Now, I'm including both the players who were drafted and the players who were regenerated by the expansion drafts. And allow me to explain what that means. The 1968 expansion draft with Montreal, the Expos selected among their 30 expansion picks, Jesus Alou, Skip Gwynn, and Jack Billingham. Those would be drafted players. Those players got traded to the Astros for Rusty Staub. So Billingham, Alou, and Gwynn would be considered drafted players, while Staub would be a regeneration player. Staub then got traded to the Mets in 1972 for Tim Foley, Ken Singleton, and Mike Jorgensen. For the purpose of this exercise, those players would be regeneration players as well. In fact, the Rusty Staub trade continued to generate players for the Expos until 1985. Now, before we continue, does anybody want to take a guess as to which team had the most successful expansion draft?
Well, if you're
I'll
just
recuse
talking
myself.
about how well, if you're just talking about how well the people drafted did, then I guarantee the Mets are not.
Well, the Mets actually factored pretty low. Anybody else want to take a guess?
The Royals, possibly.
The Royals? Anybody else want to guess either the Royals or a different team?
Colorado.
Colorado? Anybody else?
The Angels did pretty well a couple of their first couple years.
Well, at the outset of doing this exercise, my hypothesis was that the Royals were going to be the first, were going to be the best, and the Blue Jays the second best. So, question number one, talking about the overall performance of a team in the first 10 years. Any team to finish 500 in the first 10 years would get 1 point. Did I just lose the screen? No, we're fine.
Yeah, you're good.
Any team to win 90 games, 2 points. Any team to win 98 games or a 600 winning percentage, 3 points. The big winner here was the Arizona Diamondbacks, 12 points. They won 100 games in 1999, only their second season, and 92 in 2001, in which they also won the World Series. Kansas City Royals finished second with 11 points. They won 85 games in 1971, followed by American League West titles from 1976 to 1978. On the other end of the spectrum, 3 teams scored no points in this round. The Expos didn't post a winning season until 1979, the Mariners until 1991, and Tampa Bay until 2008, which was the year they met the Phillies in the World Series. Question number 2, for how many years did players selected in the drafts and acquired in trades contribute to their teams? If they were there 5 years, 1 point. If they were there 10 years, 2 points. Kansas City Royals were the winners here with 53 points. Their expansion draft in 1968 generated players such as Hal McRae, Amos Otis, Fred Patek, Marty Patton, and Kansas City native Steve Mingery. All were still with the team in 1978, and McRae remained a Royal until 1987. Second place, we have the Blue Jays with 50 points. Draft picks Jim Clancy and Ernie Witt contributed to the Drive of 85 pennant race, as did Rance Mulliniks and Damaso Garcia, both of whom were acquired in trades. Now, does anybody understand or know the significance of the card I used for Garcia? Why did I use that card? That is a Toronto Blue Jays fire safety card from 1986. 1986 was also the year that Damaso Garcia set his Blue Jays uniform on fire. Houston tied for third place with the Florida Marlins with 47 points. The Tampa Bay Devil Rays finished last with 10 points, while the Arizona Diamondbacks were next to last with 15. And the third question, how effective was the statistical output of the expansion players? In other words, WAR, what is it good for? Unveiled by Bill James at SABR 31 in Milwaukee, July 13th, 2001, WAR is defined as the number of wins a player is responsible for beyond the replacement level at the player's position. How many wins does a player's presence expect to produce over an average replacement at the same position? Among first-year teams, the Royals were at the top with a WAR of 26. The Rockies were at the bottom with a WAR of 6. Looking at the first decade for each team, the top finisher was once again the Kansas City Royals with a WAR of 184.8. 4 players, Amos Otis, Fred Patek, Hal McRae, and Al Fitzmaurice, contributed a WAR of 89.5 between 1969 and 1978. Despite their humble beginnings as the Seattle Pilots, the Milwaukee Brewers finished second with a WAR of 151.1. as the team's general manager from 1970 to 1972. Frank Trader Lane made several blockbuster deals which formed the makings of a contender in Milwaukee in 1978. 4 Brewers players, Don Money, George Boomer Scott, Jim Colburn, and Johnny Briggs, contributed a WAR of 73.4 in a Milwaukee uniform between 1970 and 1978. The Devil Rays once again fell at the low end of the spectrum with an expansion player WAR of 36.9. The Mets weren't much better at 41.8, and finishing just ahead of them was Houston with 69.4. The envelope, please. We're going to take up the results. Any guesses as to who finished last? Tampa Bay? You're right. Tampa Bay with 47 points were the bottom finishing teams. They finished in last place 9 of their first 10 years. The only year they didn't finish last was 2004 when the Blue Jays did. They won 70 games only once in 2004, and their aggregate WAR was 36.9.
Mm-hmm.
Just ahead of them, Fred, the Mets, 47 points. They
If
averaged
it weren't for
56
Gil Hodges, they'd have been last.
They averaged 56 wins each year from 62 to 68. And there were only 4 expansion players in the 1969 Mets. And of those 4, only Tommy Agee was of any significance. That's to say they were players who were selected in the expansion draft who got traded for other players who were on the World Series team. Just ahead of them, the Seattle Mariners with 115 points. No winning seasons in their first 10 years. They had only 5 last-place finishes compared to Tampa Bay, who had 9, and their aggregate WAR was 87.6. The Mariners generated quality players from the expansion draft. Some of them included Rupert Jones, Rick Honeycutt, Floyd Bannister, and Richie Zisk. The trouble was they couldn't afford to keep them. But their fortunes changed in 1987 with their first overall draft pick in baseball, selected Ken Griffey Jr. 11th place, Arizona, 116 points. They won 100 games in 99, 92 games in 2001, and 98 in 2002. But then they won only 51 in 2004. Most of the key players on the 2001 Diamondbacks were signed as free agents. The expansion draft generated Luis Gonzalez and Curt Schilling, aggregate WAR of 89.4. Next, Houston, 120 points. They had only won 500 season in 1969 and an aggregate WAR of 71.5. Colt 45s reaped the benefits of drafting Dick Farrell and Bob Bruce, and then they acquired Mike Cuellar in a trade. Overall output of expansion players was modest after moving from Colt Stadium into the Astrodome. Next, we have, who said Colorado? Colorado finished in 9th with 120 points. They struggled in their first 2 seasons, but won the wild card in 1995. Unlike Arizona, who bought a World Series title, expansion players did contribute to the quick ascent of the Rockies, including Dante Bichette, Vinny Castilla, Darren Holmes, Curtis Laskanik, Steve Reed, Kevin Ritz, and Eric Young. Finishing in 8th place, Montreal Expos, 127 points, aggregate WAR of 96.7. They had no winning seasons from 69 to 78. After going 52 and 110 in 1969, the Expos exceeded Gene Mauch's preseason prediction of 70 and 70. The Expos draft yielded several quality players such as Rusty Staub, Carl Morton, Bill Stoneman, Ron Fairley, and Ron Hunt, and contended in 1973 even though they finished with a losing record. Amid a global energy crisis and political uncertainty in Quebec, the Expos began an austerity program in 1974. One rebuilding trade that really hurt the Expos was when they sent Ken Singleton and Mike Torres to the Orioles for Dave McNally and Rich Coggins. Singleton and Torres combined had a WAR of 48.3 between 1975 and 1984. McNally and Coggins was negative, and both players were out of baseball by 1976. 7th place, San Diego, just ahead of the Expos with 127 points. They finished in last place every year from 69 to 74. Nate Colbert had a WAR of 17.2. Their edge over the Expos was they did have a winning season of 84 and 78 in 1978. Sixth place, Marlins, 137 points. Only one winning season in their first 10 years in 1997, which was the year they won the World Series. They didn't contend again until 2003 when they won yet another World Series. The 1997 Marlins featured Jeff Conine and Gary Sheffield, both players generated by the expansion draft. Sheffield was traded to the Dodgers in I can't believe I said blockbuster deal, for Mike Piazza, who generated trades for Preston Wilson and Mike Lowell. Fifth place, the Angels, 152 points. Somebody here said the Angels. Nobody expected the Angels to win as many as 50 games in 1961, but they won 70, which is still the expansion record. A year later, they won 86. Now, the last time I did this, somebody asked me who the older gentleman is in the picture with Art Moreno. That was Eli Gerba. Eli Gerba was the original Angel, and I believe he was the opening day starter as well. Jim Fregosi, drafted from the Red Sox, provided the Angels with WAR of 45.2 between 1961 and 1970. Dean Chance, traded from Washington, had a WAR of 20.5 from 1961 to 1966. And Fregosi was sent to the Mets in a 1971 trade, which brought Nolan Ryan to Orange County through the 1979 season. Fourth place, Toronto Blue Jays, 167 points, aggregate WAR 116.4. 1977 to 1980, they averaged 58 wins, but 1983 to 1993, they averaged 91 wins. 5 division titles and 2 World Series between 1985 and 1993. Draft picks: Jim Clancy, Garth Orge, and Ernie Witt combined for a WAR of 31.8 from 1977 to 1986. The draft generated players such as Roy Howell and Alfredo Griffin through trades. The Blue Jays would have ranked higher but for their sterling farm system and shrewd Rule 5 draft picks, including Paul Hodgson, Lloyd Moseby, and Willie Upshaw, who were all seen here. Third place, Seattle Pilots and Milwaukee Brewers, 188 points. Pilots finished 68-94 in their only major league season, while the Brewers remained in the doldrums of their division until 1978, when George Bamberger had imported the Oriole Way from Baltimore. The Frank Lade trades of the early 70s brought several talented players to Sud City. In 1976, George Scott was traded back to the Red Sox for Cecil Cooper, who hit .352 in 1980 and was a Brewer until 1987. Second place, this is a surprise, Washington Senators, 190 points. Like the Brewers, the Senators had only one winning season in their first 10 years. They owed their high rank to the acumen of their general managers to trade effectively. In 1961, the Senators traded Dave Sisler to the Reds for Claude Osteen, who provided the Senators with a WAR of 9.0 from 1961 to 1964. He was traded to the Dodgers that offseason for Frank Howard, Ken McMullen, Phil Ortega, Pete Rickard, and Dick Nen. They contributed a WAR of 54.2 from 1965 to 1970 and generated quality players for the franchise long after they moved to Dallas in 1971. Now we get to number 1, Kansas City, 249 points, aggregate WAR 184.8. The Royals have Ewing Kauffman to thank for their early success. Mr. K was not even a baseball fan, but rather a civic-minded billionaire who shared in the Kansas City's malaise of losing the A's to Oakland in 1967. 3 expansion teams, the Royals, the Brewers, and the Blue Jays, emerged as contenders within the first 10 years. Expansion has been a successful experiment as American commerce and industry have shifted from the Northeast to the West and the South. Major League Baseball teams have thrived from coast to coast, and in Canada, it was time for expansion baseball.
All right, Maxwell, thank you for that. That was an excellent presentation, and
You're welcome.
I'm glad that's where it pivoted, because that was one of the notes I made was about the Kansas City Royals expansion draft, and that chapter in the book about which team did the best. Like, if you, I guess, elaborate on what made Kansas City's so successful wasn't so much the draft itself, but who they got for those regeneration players. Their expansion draft itself was really interesting. They drafted a lot of players, including Hall of Famer Hoyt Wilhelm, who would never actually play for them. And for our purposes, Oklahoma native Jerry Adair, who did play for them for a little bit. But Kansas City, yeah, made their hay basically through those regeneration players.
I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome Richard Hausman to the meeting. Welcome, Richard. If I can share an amusing story about how Richard and I met. We were, it was the SABR convention in 2011 in Los Angeles. 4 of us were going to go to an Angels game. 2 of the 4 dropped out, so we found one fellow in the lobby, and then Richard approached us and says, "Can I come?" We said, "Sure." And as we're leaving the game, we're in the Angels parking lot. We're talking about different things to do in the Los Angeles area. And Richard's been watching me the whole game. And one of the things we're talking about La Brea Tar Pits, we talked about Hollywood, this, that, and the other. And then I mentioned the Nixon Museum. And Richard says to me, "You can't go to the Nixon Museum." I said, "Why not?" I said, "Because you're Jewish." And I fell to the ground on my knees laughing.
Richard, you're muted, so whatever you said in response, I couldn't hear.
I think everybody's muted.
Oh yeah, they may very well be, but now that the presentation's over, feel free if anyone does want to, they can unmute themselves. I don't.
So I'm happy to answer any questions anybody might have. If you're able to unmute yourselves, I do not read American Sign Language or any other kind of sign language, so I'm afraid I'm not of any great use there.
You have one comment. You mentioned the Expos contended in 1973. A little context would be important.
All right.
I think the Cleveland Spiders would have contended in the National League East in 1973.
Well, I'll give you some context, and I know, Fred, I know what your favorite team is, and I know that's why you asked the question. Reporters were calling the division the NL least with an L, in the sense that it was a division that it seemed like nobody wanted to win. The Mets squeaked by with a record of 82-79 to lead the division. St. Louis finished in second with a 500 record. Pittsburgh was below 500, and the Expos were behind them below 500 as well. But the Expos, I think as late as September 24th, were actually in first place with a record of something like 77-76 or something like that. So it was basically a division up for grabs. Clearly, the 2 best teams in the league were Cincinnati and Los Angeles. In theory, those were the teams that should have faced each other in the NLCS. But as we know, neither of them made it to the World Series because the Mets managed to get past Cincinnati in 5 games.
And I credit Bud Harrelson beating up Pete Rose for that.
I just wanted to say one thing, that it's interesting when you look at each expansion year, because it was the different generations with baseball. So you see how each team built it up. Like with Arizona, they managed to be more. I could be wrong, but they were like a little more successful because they were able to build themselves up for free agency. Where the other teams, like years back, it was a little bit different how they built themselves through expansion.
That's an excellent point, Mark, that the more recent franchises had more lead time to build their team. I mean, I was in the lobby of the departure lounge of the Fort Lauderdale airport in an aborted spring training trip in 1995. And the reason I say aborted is because that was the year they were on strike. They were using replacement players. It hadn't been resolved, and Major League Baseball was going to expand in 1998. So 3 years hence, so they had 3 years to develop a farm system, 3 years to find quality personnel from other organizations, 3 years to develop scouting. I mean, if you recall, there were a couple of trades that were pre-engineered on draft day where the expansion teams would draft players and then trade them back to the teams that they drafted them from to get younger players. You compare that with the first expansion draft. That was 1960. Gene Autry went to the winter meetings to try and secure radio rights for one of the existing teams. He had no idea he was going to leave the winter meetings buying a team because he had no idea that there were even teams that were on the market through expansion. That was December of 1960 to get ready for baseball in April of 1961. They had not even 4 months. So they really weren't given a lot of lead time, and the rules for expanding became more lenient with the passage of time. It was the teams were allowed to protect a lot more players with the earlier expansion drafts, and it became a lot more favorable with the later ones. I mean, there was free agency in 1977, but no free agent was going to sign with Seattle or Toronto. The other thing that changed that benefit the 1993 and 1998 expansion drafts was up until then, you could only select players from your own league. In deference to Fred, I'm going to talk about another Mets connection to the expansion draft, a 69 Met, in fact, and that was Rod Gaspar. Rod Gaspar had played for Hawaii for 6 years, and some of those years he played for Roy Hartsfield, who was the manager of the expansion Blue Jays. And when Hartsfield was not picked up in the expansion draft, Gaspar was not picked up in the expansion draft, he chose to retire. Years later, he ran into Roy Hartsfield, and he asked him the question, why didn't you select me in the expansion draft? And Roy Hartsfield's answer was, I would have loved to have selected you in the expansion draft. You would have been my starting center fielder. But you were under contract with the Padres, which was a National League team, and I could only select American League players. Now, there were some Hawaii Islanders who were selected in the expansion draft by the Blue Jays, but those players had not been under contract with San Diego. They were under contract with Hawaii directly, and since that made them independent, they weren't subject to American League rules.
I was wondering if anybody had any thoughts about the relative importance of the front office versus a deep pockets owner in this success respect.
Oh,
Maxwell, before you answer, I have to leave. Thank you for heading this up. It's good to see you again. Hopefully we'll see each other soon.
Yeah, hope to see you in person in the Bay Area later this month.
Terrific. I'm looking forward to it.
All right, we'll see you then. Okay, bye. All right. So you asked about the relationship between deep pockets and savvy executives at the top. And I think you need both. I mean, you have a team like the Expos, who had deep pockets and who had good management. They were able to build for the long run, and although their time as contenders was very short, it was from, let's say, 1979 until midway through 1983, they had the resources that they could make that commitment. Then you look at a team like the Washington Senators, who had a good general manager in George Selkirk in the beginning, and he was able to assemble a team that was on the verge of contending. Bob Short bought the team in 1969, who was broke. And so all the good work that had gone into assembling the Senators over the previous 8 or 9 years got disassembled pretty quickly, highlighted by the Denny McLain trade, when they traded away a wonderful left side of the infield in Aurelio Rodriguez and Eddie Brinkman, a potential 20-game winner in Joe Coleman, for Denny McLain, who, as far as I'm concerned, did nothing for Washington. They thought that they were going to be able to rescue the franchise by bringing in a meal ticket who was going to sell tickets to the games. By the end of the season, they were on their way to Texas, and he was on his way to Oakland. So I think it's important to have deep pockets. It's important to have smart people running the teams, but really you needed both if you wanted to move forward. And that's part of why Kansas City did as well as they did. They had people like Cedric Tallis and Joe Burke and the financial backing of the Kaufmans. And that's what made them a success partially.
The deep pockets wouldn't really have been an issue for the first 4 teams because free agency didn't exist. You basically had to rely on the old baseball brains, which apparently the Mets did not have because their what they did was, hey, all the guys that I liked when I was a kid, let's see if we can get them to play for us.
Well, the Mets' early rosters were the front office was primarily from the Yankees, and the players were highlighted of guys who had played for the Giants and the Dodgers, who might have made a few all-star teams if they had played together 10 years before.
Yeah.
But by now, these guys were probably ready for a different career other than playing baseball. And so you saw the Mets, their first year, had a record of 40 on 120 and really didn't get to be respectfully bad. They were just bad, but respectfully bad until 1968 when they finished 73 and 89.
Yeah, it was like their managers just picked people that their kids wanted the autographs of or something.
I want to commend myself for not weeping when you brought up the Jim Fregosi trade. Because that one still hurts.
I was thinking that when I heard that. Yeah, I was thinking the same thing with that trade.
Well,
I suppose it would be possible to quantify the deep pockets aspect of it, to look up the net worth of each owner or ownership group at the time of the expansion. I don't know how you quantify the quality of the front office.
Well, you'd have to be their accountants, and they're not talking.
Yeah.
Well, you'd have to know more than what their net worth was. Also include how much they're willing to spend of that net worth.
That's true.
I mean, one owner who was extremely wealthy. This wasn't an expansion team, but from another generation, David Glass, when he owned the Kansas City Royals, was exceptionally wealthy and wouldn't spend a cent. And a lot of these other owners, a lot of them were leveraged. They would build the team with borrowed money, and then in one instance, you had the owner of the early San Diego Padres, a fellow by the name of C. Arnold Smith, who in 1973 was found guilty of making illegal contributions to a certain presidential campaign. And this was only uncovered by the failure of a bank that he was the president of. So he had to surrender his team pretty quickly.
Is that why San Diego was thinking of moving to Washington in 74?
Yeah, exactly. That's they were having a hard time finding a buyer anywhere. Major League Baseball took over the management of the franchise for the last part of the 1973 season. Not Major League Baseball, the National League. And then Joseph Danzansky, who owned the giant supermarket chain in the DC area, he wanted to buy the team and move them to Washington. And that fell through. And then at the last minute, Ray Kroc was able to buy the team and keep them in San Diego. And some of the owners' fortunes changed. I mean, Roy Hofheinz was doing very well in the beginning, and then in 1970, he suffered a stroke and wasn't able to perpetuate his business empire, and that coincided with the energy crisis. So by 1976, Hofheinz had no control over the Astros any longer. It was now being managed by companies, essentially, to whom Hofheinz owed money. So from about 75 to 79, the Astros were playing without an owner.
And I just want to say about the Mets, you talk about the Mets, how bad they were. I think I used to hear stories like Casey Stengel used to fall asleep on the bench and he would forget the players' names or something.
Well, and he even put two players with the same name as roommates.
Bob Miller and Bob Miller.
That's right.
Yeah.
That way, if he called one of them, he had a 50% chance of getting it right. Or then you had Choo Choo Coleman when his roommate his first year was Charlie Neal. And they show up in spring training together. And Charlie Neal comes on the field and he says to Choo Choo, "You remember my name, don't you?" He says, "Yep, Bob, you're number 4. Choo Choo didn't even remember his own wife's name. Ralph Kiner had him on Kiner's corner and says, "What's your wife's name and what she likes?" She goes, "Her name's Mrs. Coleman and she likes me, Bub." Anybody else have questions, any comments, anything they want to share?
I always wondered with. Go ahead.
Oh, when you were talking earlier about players who were drafted in the expansion draft and then immediately traded back for younger players that got some gears moving, and I looked it up. That happened with Bobby Abreu, who was drafted by the Tampa Bay at the time Devil Rays, and the same day he was traded to the Phillies for Kevin Stalker. I knew that sounded familiar.
He was one of the players, and then Dimitri Young was traded back to the Cincinnati Reds. I don't remember who they got in return for him. Another one that didn't involve the same team, but Travis Fryman was traded to the Cleveland Indians for some younger players. You mentioned Hoyt Wilhelm before. He was traded to the Angels immediately after the expansion draft, and they got, I think it was Ed Kirkpatrick and Dennis Pepke in return.
Maxwell, it was the answer to this question. Was there anyone who was drafted in 2 different expansion drafts?
It has happened. Bobby Shantz. He was drafted by the Washington Senators in 1961 and the Houston Colt 45s in 1962. Now, interesting story about Bobby Shantz. When he got drafted, the intention was to trade him to the St. Louis Cardinals. And you know who they were going to get in return? Right-handed pitcher, 2
Number
years in the
45.
majors. He'd been struggling up until that point.
Broglio,
I could see you say it.
Broglio?
Huh?
Is it Gibson or Broglio? Had to be one of them, right?
It was Bob Gibson.
Yeah.
Bob Gibson. And there were a few others who were selected in 2 different expansion drafts. I'm drawing a blank as to who they might have been right now, but there were a couple others.
Okay.
There
Also
was one I
wondered
saw when
how many of the owners, not just expansion owners, but in general, how many of the owners in baseball are actually baseball fans as opposed to viewing it as some kind of investment?
Well, the one owner who was definitely a fan was also perhaps the owner least qualified to own a team was Marge Schott. She was a huge Reds fan.
Mm-hmm.
And she just wouldn't invest any money in the team.
Her people skills were a little bit lacking too.
Yeah, that would be like saying the cover of my book's a little bit green.
Yeah, Kaufman was definitely not a baseball fan.
No, Mrs. Kaufman was.
Yeah.
But Mr. Kaufman wasn't. Charles Bronfman was a baseball fan. He was 15 years old when Jackie Robinson played for the Royals, and the Montreal Royals, that is, and that sort of cemented him for life. I mean, a lot of these guys.
I think Gene Autry was a pretty much a fan.
I think you're probably right about Gene Autry. A lot of these guys used baseball as a vehicle to make money, or a vehicle to equalize losses, and bottom line is, if they make money, they'll stay in the game. If they don't make money, they'll try and sell the team.
Well, I think in the expansion era, you had kind of 2 different types of owners, right? There was sort of a transition of guys like Gussie Busch, who owned a brewery and made most of his money on beer. But you still had some of the older owners like Griffith, his income was based the team, right? He didn't have an outside income. So you kind of had a transition going on in the 60s and 70s between 2 different kinds of owners.
Historians agree that the Griffiths were the last family to derive their primary source of income through baseball. The other thing I was going to mention when we were talking about 1973 is that there was a SABR article that came out when the SABR convention went to St. Louis that argued that if the Cardinals had not traded Steve Carlton and Jerry Royce prior to the 1972 season, St. Louis would have run away with the division that year. They would have also won the division in 1974, 1977, and 1981.
Yeah, you're bringing up some really painful memories for me. The Cardinals finishing 1 or 2 games out in the 70s consistently there for a while. Yeah, they traded Carlton, and he wasn't the only one. They had a few other. Bing Devine either had to trade because of the owner, or he made some bad trades before being a pretty decent GM prior to that. But
Well, I think Bing Devine was a good general manager as long as he could afford the players he was paying. And then, like so many teams, when the salaries began to increase, they couldn't compete, and so they wanted to make sure they were fiscally responsible. And unfortunately, the product on the field suffered. The other team that happened with was Philadelphia. I mean, the Carpenters stayed in the game as long as they could afford it. And then after the World Series, they realized what they were getting themselves into. And if they wanted to keep that team together, it was going to cost them a fortune. And they ended up selling the team to a group led by Bill Giles, and they were able to keep Schmidt and Carlton and Pete Rose, at least Pete Rose for a couple of years, but just about everybody else they traded, and a lot of those guys ended up getting traded to the Chicago Cubs.
Well, they'd have been better off if they let Pete Rose go.
Oh,
His last few years of his career, he was well below average in every metric.
well, Pete Rose's last good year was 1982, and he should have called it quits then. He was
Well, he wanted Ty Cobb's record, and he didn't care.
and he wanted it in a Cincinnati uniform too.
Mhm.
He was like,
I've
so
got
many
a jersey
players
here that's the answer to a trivia question. I don't know if any of you guys could, I don't know if I can hold this up and let you see the jersey at the same time. It's maybe you can guess the trivia question if I show you the jersey.
The only player to throw a cherry bomb into the bullpen.
He was the first guy to win a game for the Royals. The winning pitcher in the first Royals win. So,
Well, for me, when I see his name, I think of he probably still has the record for most consecutive strikeouts in a World Series game by a relief pitcher.
1966.
Yeah.
Well, there was a picture of Drabowski in the slides.
oh yeah,
Like if I can go back.
probably one of the few baseball players born in Poland would be my guess
Yep.
as well.
Yep. Let me figure out how to do this again. And
He's one of many that we're still trying to figure out where he's buried, if indeed he is.
all right, I don't know how you can zoom in on this, but if you the big
You need to share it.
that'll help. The big picture here is a Royals program from the late 70s, but in the inset, you see Mr. and Mrs. Coffin receiving a birthday cake, and the player giving them the cake is Mo Drabowski.
Okay. So considering what we know about him, it's sort of a surprise that he didn't just slam it into their faces.
That's why I used the picture. And you'll see that picture in the book as well.
One of the things I remember it was kind of surprising to me with the book was Frank Lane, who I always thought was kind of an overrated GM. He actually did a really good job with the Brewers and made some really decent trades. And even though they weren't super successful, he kind of helped them at least get respectable pretty quickly there.
Yeah, they were building for the future. They had no farm system, and this helped. They put players who would help them on the field for a couple of years, like George Scott or like Don Money, or like the pitcher. They got Jim Lonborg and Ken Brett each for a year. The other GM who was very successful for them was Frank Lane's predecessor, and that was Marvin Milks. The Brewers, the first year in 1970, had a horrible first half, and then the second half they played really well. In fact, they offered Marvin Milks a 5-year contract to stay in Milwaukee. Milks had health issues and had to decline on that basis. But if Marvin Milks had stayed with the Brewers, who knows? They may have contended sooner.
I do have another question, but before I do that, I'm going to do a little shameless self-promotion. I just put a link in the chat. It's a video that a friend of mine did, chronicling my 10,000th grade visit in Cooperstown. So I think it's 11 minutes long. You may or may not find it interesting, but he flew up from Arkansas just to chronicle that for me, which I really appreciated. Did you look at all at? I mean, obviously, did look at the expansion draft. Were there any of the teams that were particularly good? This wouldn't apply to the first four. Particularly good with the Major League Baseball draft starting in 1965.
Well, the Blue Jays did really well with that. The Blue Jays did particularly well with the Rule 5 draft. San Diego, being in last place the first 6 years of their existence, all had high draft choices, but they didn't do very well with those. See, a lot of the early teams, an easy way to cut back was on scouting. And so that only kept them in a vicious circle that they wouldn't, without good scouting, without good talent on the farm system, it was difficult for the teams to advance. In fact, I've made the argument with the Expos. The two best players that they drafted in those years were Andre Dawson and Gary Carter. And the only reason they had a shot at either of them was because they weren't natural baseball players. They were football players who both suffered injuries in their high school football career. If they didn't have those injuries, they might have been professional football players, or they might have signed with another team that was able to offer them more money in baseball.
The Padres, they're the source of one of my, as a mathematician, I have to love this, one of my favorite trivia things. And I don't know that it's a record, but I'm pretty sure it probably is. What player had the highest percentage or knocked in the highest percentage of his team's runs in a season?
Oh, Nate Colbert.
Yeah, 111 out of the 488 runs that they scored in 1972, I think it was. 22%. That's just insane.
Well, the Nate Colbert trivia question that I like, and I referenced this somewhere in the book, was, anyway, this is good for the Cardinal fans here. Stan Musial hit 5 home runs in a doubleheader in 1964. Nate Colbert, 8-year-old kid living in St. Louis, was at the game. And as he's leaving, he said, "I don't think anybody else is going to do that. Certainly not me." Guess what?
Yeah, he's like Mike Trout, just a really, really good ball player stuck on just a really, really lousy team.
And who got injured all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Nate Colbert, I'm sure this is a record, played on last place teams for 9 consecutive years.
Oh.
The 1968 Houston Astros, the Padres every year from 69 to 74, the 1975 Detroit Tigers, the 1975 Montreal Expos, and the 1976 Montreal Expos. And had he made the Blue Jays in 1977, that would have been 10 years, but he didn't make the team.
I can relate to that. I was on the golf team for Booker T. Washington High School in Tulsa. We lost every single match we participated in and came in dead last in the city championship. So we didn't have a lot of team spirit that year.
Well, you could brag about that. Just don't tell people the sport. Tell people that you were on the highest scoring team in the city.
Anybody else?
I had one. You're talking about players who were drafted in 2 different expansion drafts, but when I was sort of preparing for this, I found one that was interesting. Lou Piniella, who may be one of the more interesting people in baseball history all around, was drafted by the Seattle Pilots initially, but then was traded to the Royals, another expansion team, for an Oklahoma native, John Gelnar. So he wasn't drafted, but he was traded almost immediately after the draft to another expansion team.
Yeah, because you couldn't get along with Nikita Khrushchev. I'm sorry, I mean Joe Schultz.
Joe Schultz is one player who is, I think he and his son are on the same grave marker.
His father.
Father, yes, father. In Calvary Cemetery in St. Louis. A Toronto player who also has one of my favorite trivia questions, Carlos Delgado, hit 2 home runs in the game in which he hit his 100th career home run. He hit 3 in the game in which he hit his 200th career home run. He hit 4 in the game in which he hit his 300th career home run. He did get his 400th career home run, but unfortunately, he did not hit 5 in that game. I think he hit 2 in that game, but not 5.
I never knew that. And he was still playing for the Blue Jays when he hit 4 home runs in a game. I'm surprised not more wasn't made of the fact that it was his 300th home run.
Mm-hmm. He was a guy who just didn't seem to. I don't want to say didn't care about recognition, but he didn't seem to be. Some guys seem to like to draw attention to themselves. He never seemed to do that in my mind. He just went out there and played really, really well.
As did another power hitter on the Blue Jays of a more recent vintage. That was Jose Bautista.
He was a little more flamboyant than. He also needs to work on his boxing defense skills.
Oh yeah, especially against Venezuelan second baseman for the Rangers. Now, Jose Bautista, I believe. I don't know how many players can make this claim, but he played for the Mets both his first year and his last year, but none of the years in between.
Okay. Well, Ed Craneville played for the Mets his first year and his last year, but also
every year in between. And if the Payson family hadn't sold the team, he'd probably still be playing for them.
How many of the teams do have somebody like that play? I mean, you could have somebody who played for the Expos for 1 year, but that doesn't count. Played for their first year with the team, last year with the team, and at least a couple or 5 years in between. I mean, did you have any idea for the other team, some guys like that?
Somebody like Gary Carter played his first 10 years or so with the Expos and then came back in his last year. I don't know if that's what you mean.
No, I'm looking only played for the one team. I mean, Jeff Bagwell. No,
yeah, Jeff Bagwell only
never.
He only played for the Astros.
He never played for the Red Sox. He was with the Red Sox, but never played for
farm
them.
System.
So
there have been a
would
few.
be one.
There have been not as many as there used to be, but there have been a few who've played their entire career with one team.
Yeah.
In fact, the year that Tony Gwynn played his 20th year with the Padres, which was also his final year with the Padres, the front cover of the Padres yearbook that year had all the players who played 20 or more years with only one team. And
that was not a large number of people.
No, and I believe the only one of those not in the Hall of Fame is Mel Harder.
So another thing that comes up to me that's sort of also probably difficult to quantify is how many of these teams moved into an existing stadium, or I guess another way to put it is how many of them already had like a stadium underway, or, I mean, like the Royals moved into an existing stadium, but they built a new one very quickly. Is that a very common pattern as you look over these teams?
That's an excellent question. That a lot of the teams were awarded to cities on the condition that they would be given a new team. New York City, or the city of Queens to be more specific, was already building Shea Stadium when the Mets were awarded the franchise. Houston Colt 45's Colt Stadium was only supposed to be a temporary facility. They were already building the Astrodome. I would think most of the expansion teams either were given new stadiums or the promise of moving into a new stadium very quickly. San Diego got the team because they had a new stadium that had just been built. Part of the reason the Seattle Pilots left was because they couldn't keep the team solvent for another 6 years to when the Kingdom was going to be built. They were playing in a minor league facility, Sick Stadium. And then they moved into another stadium, Milwaukee County Stadium, which had been used by the Milwaukee Braves for several years beforehand. You mentioned Kansas City. That I think the Royals and the Chiefs both were promised new stadiums. I think the Chiefs had come into the league a couple of years before the Royals, but those plans were already underway. The only one that didn't get a new stadium very soon after they got the team was the Marlins.
The Astros Stadium, Colt Stadium, was that a minor league facility prior, or what was that?
Before that, they played in a stadium called Buff Stadium. And I had always thought that Buff Stadium and Colt Stadium were the same facility. They were not. Colt Stadium was built in what later became the parking lot for the Astrodome.
Mhm.
And it was just a temporary facility. It still stands. They
okay.
moved it brick by brick to Mexico, and a Mexican league team plays there now.
Did they take the mosquitoes with them? Because my recollection is that the mosquitoes were of legendary size there.
I think Mexico probably has its own mosquitoes. Yeah, no, the reports were that the most successful concession item was not beer, was not hot dogs, but off.
Montreal never got a stadium right away, not until 1976.
Not till 1977 when they got
Yeah,
the
that's after Olympics. That's what I'm thinking of. Yeah.
They were supposed to have moved in 1972. They were building Olympic Stadium for the Olympics. And then that year, the construction crew went on strike, and it didn't get resolved for a couple of years, I think.
Got another question about the Colt Stadium. When it was removed to Mexico, did they work hard to try to get Jim Umbricht's ashes to take with them? Because his ashes were scattered in Colt Stadium.
I don't know the fate of Jim Umbright's ashes, and I don't think anyone could answer that question.
I'm guessing the answer is they didn't worry too much about it.
I'm guessing it's something nobody even thought about.
Fred, you need to get a marker on whatever parking place it is, so people know they're parking on wherever his ashes were scattered.
And if you have a question about Kurt Bleffery's ashes vis-a-vis Memorial Stadium, I'm pretty sure it's the same answer.
Dave May is there too. His ashes were scattered there as well.
Well,
if anybody happens to know where Brooks Robinson is, I'd love to find out.
Dave May's son told me a great story about him. I mean, this would be of particular interest to people who listen to music in the 70s. One of my favorite 70s bands is a band called Hamilton, Joe, Frank, and Reynolds. And they had a song called Daisy May. And I'd hear the song, and every time I'd hear it, I'd think of the name Davy May. And I mentioned this to Davy May's son. He said, "Funny you should say that. My dad's nickname was Daisy because of the song."
The marker thing that you brought up for the ashes in the parking lot reminded me of one of the more interesting things about Old Six Stadium, despite the fact that it could have doubled as a Superfund site, is that where old home plate was at Six Stadium is now a parking lot of a Lowe's in Seattle, and
Yep.
someone put up a sort of minimalist looking statue of a batter basically out front the entrance of Lowe's, and that's where home plate was at Old Six Stadium.
They've done something similar at where Veterans Stadium used to be in Philadelphia.
That's where Tug McGraw was scattered.
Oh, really?
Yes.
You got to believe.
Is there a population base size necessary to support an expansion franchise, or has it altered over the years? Or I mean, people talk about future expansion maybe in places like Austin or someplace, and you just wonder about the population base in some of those places.
I
mean, if Pittsburgh didn't have a team, would Major League Baseball consider them?
Today, I don't think they would. I mean, the city of Pittsburgh itself has a population of only about 400,000. You include some of the surrounding area like Mount Lebanon, it would probably be closer to 1 million. But it's still one of the smaller cities in Major League Baseball. I don't think Montreal would get a team now. I mean, Montreal was the largest city in Canada when it got the Expos. But after 1976, when René Lévesque won the election for the Parti Québécois, whose aim was to break up Canada, people were leaving Montreal in droves, and business left Montreal in droves. And a lot of Toronto's wealth benefited from that. So I don't think Montreal would get a team today. They did a study about 20 years ago about what the most successful expansion city would be. And you know what the answer was? A third team in New York. They're the population that could support it. But the problem there is they would have to pay an indemnity fee to both the Mets and the Yankees.
Yeah, if you just look at the population of the city, St. Louis wouldn't be able to 'Cause, I mean, it's only down, it's down about 300,000 people.
St. Louis or
But
Kansas
that's
City.
because everybody's moved out to the suburbs.
Mhm.
Yeah, less than 300,000 now.
Is it now? Okay.
Yeah, it's 275 or something like that.
Really?
Yeah, I think Kansas City has also lost a
Yeah.
pretty good percentage of its population.
Kansas City and Cincinnati's another one.
Baltimore may very well be.
Yeah, Baltimore's population, I think, is half what it was when the Orioles came to Baltimore. Up until 10 years ago, I would have said Detroit, but Detroit started to rebound a little bit.
Hmm. When I was there a couple of years ago, it didn't look like it had rebounded much.
Yeah, last time I was there was 2014, and it was still pretty bad then.
Yeah.
It doesn't take a lot to rebound from where it was.
Well, that's true too.
Yeah, it's like, I guess, Green Bay, you know, I mean, obviously they wouldn't have a team if the NFL was starting over today, but
Well, you look at Green Bay's ownership, how it's owned by a conglomeration of local businesses and people. I mean, I could walk into the Green Bay Packers front office and buy shares of the team.
right.
And that ownership structure could be why, A, they have a team, and B, it flourishes the way it does.
I think
big
a
is-
lot of that is the team's history.
Yeah.
I mean, the area owns it in a way that I don't know too many other sports franchises do.
Mhm.
How big is Denver now? Denver's not an enormous city. It's in and of itself. I mean, the area is enormous.
I was going to say, I
Maybe-
think it's the largest city in the Mountain Time Zone, but that's Phoenix.
Yeah, I think Denver may be 500,000 or so.
Phoenix is huge, by the way.
Yeah.
Phoenix is now the 5th largest city in the United States.
2020 census, Denver was 700,000.
Hmm.
Metro area, almost 3 million.
But looking at population size, Austin or San Antonio or even Fort Worth might be able to support a team more than some of the existing cities do.
Mhm.
So, given all that, and given what appears to be an inevitability that baseball is going to expand to 32, which two do you think, having written this book and or edited it and worked on it, which two of these two teams do you, or two cities do you think would be the best candidates for what I think is an inevitable expansion?
Oh, good question. Have to look at population size, population wealth, proximity to other teams. One ownership group that's been trying to get a team for years, and they have a sizable market behind them, is the city of Nashville, Tennessee. I think they're a good candidate. Another city that I think would be a good candidate, it's other than its proximity to Nashville, would be the Raleigh-Durham area, North Carolina. They might be able to support it. They do very well with the hockey team, with the Carolina Hurricanes. Looking at cities that may have lost teams, maybe one of the cities in Texas I just mentioned, they're not going to go to Fort Worth, but maybe they'll go to the Astros are going to try to keep a team out of San Antonio and Austin pretty well. New Orleans lost its minor league team, so I don't see a major league team going there. I definitely don't see another team going to Oakland.
What about Mexico City or Honolulu?
Honolulu's too far. That's why the AAA team didn't pan out.
Okay.
And Mexico City, you're dealing with a whole lot of regulatory issues with another country, which may serve as an impediment.
And the elevation.
The elevation's another one, but Honolulu got its team in a AAA team in 1961 with the idea that a major league team might go there eventually. And just the cost of travel to and from the mainland made that an unsustainable investment. By 1987.
Yeah, just to have one team out there is not practical. I mean, that's why the Dodgers, the Giants needed to move together, is so teams could make a West Coast trip.
Yeah, with Honolulu, teams would almost have to have an off day before and after any series that they played there.
And yet, if you look at the American League from 1961 to 1967, a West Coast trip only included one team, the Angels.
Are there any European countries that would conceivably support even a minor league team? I don't know.
I think it'd be difficult to find any European city that has that much of an interest in baseball. As far as I know, there's only 2 countries in Europe that have professional leagues. One is Italy and the other one's the Netherlands. And they play at a level that would be comparable to, I would say, between single A and double A. Major League Baseball has gone to London a couple times, and those games typically sell out, but we're talking about 2 games as opposed to an 81 game season.
If you were looking at countries where there's an enthusiasm for baseball, you could certainly have Venezuela and the Dominican Republic, but I certainly with Venezuela, I see there would be some issues.
Let Venezuela sort its elections problem first before they think about an expansion team. Well, they actually tried a league involving many Latin American countries. It was the Inter-American League, founded by Bobby Maduro. This was in 1979. And between bad weather and visa issues and travel issues and scoreboards that didn't work and all sorts of problems, of the 6 teams, 2 of them folded at the end of May and 2 more folded at the end of June. And so you're not going to have a team with 2 leagues, so they just decided to mothball the entire league and declare Miami the champions. So, and that was a AAA league. So I don't think Major League Baseball ever since then would be too warm to the idea of bringing a major league team anywhere south of the Rio Grande.
What about Puerto Rico, since they turfed the Expos there for a little while at the Hiram Beathorn Stadium? Not technically a different country, but that seems like an outside possibility, putting one in San Juan.
Well, Hiram Beathorn Stadium, that was 20 years ago that they hosted the teams. I don't know what sort of upkeep they've done with that stadium. It was a very small stadium. It may have met Major League Baseball standards then. I'm not sure that it necessarily would now, particularly after the hurricane in 2017, which devastated the entire island. How much money would the team have to spend in order to bring the stadium up to standard?
Would Fenway fit Major League standards if it wasn't grandfathered in?
Having been there during a rain delay, I'm not sure that it would. I remember seeing this little lake accumulate in the stands behind home plate.
Well, Municipal Stadium in Cleveland was probably worse than that. It was not a good one.
The mistake by the lake.
Yeah.
But to answer your question about other cities that might support expansion, I don't think you'd put a team in Orlando because it's too close to Tampa Bay or Miami. I would love to see a team in Vancouver, but that's not going to happen. The Greenpeace people would get in the way of any measures to try and build a new stadium there. And for those of you who've been to Vancouver, it's a very difficult city to navigate. There's no real space to build a new stadium. There's not a lot of place to park. There's no freeways in the city. They have a minor league stadium, Nat Bailey Stadium, which is a nice place to watch a minor league game. But home plate faces west. If you've ever seen the early innings of a night game, makes the ball impossible to follow there. So I don't think they'd use that stadium for a major league team.
Do you think they'd maybe consider trying to put a major league team on the south side of Chicago?
Oh, they're having enough trouble with one there now.
I think
Just be lucky Ron's not here to hear that. Yeah.
I think Salt Lake City has a committee to try to get a team, but they need a stadium, I think, and some other things to happen. But they are possible, depending on how many years down the road we're looking at before it happens.
What's the current state of the athletics project in Las Vegas. I don't really know.
Last I heard, it was supposed to be ready by 2028, but anything could happen in that city with construction snags or labor unions or who knows what. We do know that they're going to be in Sacramento for at least the next 3 years.
Would Sacramento be able to support them if they ended up having to stay there?
I think for more than a temporary arrangement, they would need to aggrandize a stadium just as they did Dallas Fort Worth with Arlington Stadium or some of the other minor league stadiums that became major league stadiums.
I think Tampa Bay is actually going to beat the A's to get a stadium, which is kind of ironic, I guess.
Yeah.
They're going to get their stadium and get it resolved, and the A's are still going to be in Sacramento.
Where will the new Tampa Stadium be?
Pardon me?
Where will I was asking really Kevin, but you could welcome answer too. Is where will the new Tampa Bay Stadium be?
I don't know.
Because the current location is a nightmare.
I'm not familiar with Tampa Bay, but I think they've resolved some kind of issue about. I know there's an issue with the current stadium and where it's located.
What I do know is that the new stadium is in their infinite wisdom, they're not solving the main problem of the stadium with the new location. The main problem is driving along the I-275 between Tampa and St. Pete is hell during rush hour. So where are they going to build the new stadium? In St. Pete. Not too far from the old one. So you're going to have the same traffic problem, the same rush hour, and after the novelty wears off, people probably aren't going to go to the games.
No, and I've
thought that.
Oh, go ahead.
I've always thought that like the Marlins, one of their biggest problems is that just about everybody who lives in the Miami area came from the north, so they're already fans of some other team.
Mm-hmm.
Is that as much of a problem for Tampa Bay? I don't know that it's the retirement. I mean, my friends in New Jersey tell me that Miami is the 6th borough of New York City.
Well, I think Tampa Bay.
The area just to the south of Tampa is very heavily New York.
Okay.
The Sarasota, that area around in there is very heavily New York migrants. I don't know about farther north. Never been there.
I don't know the age of the population or the fandom of the population in the Tampa St. Petersburg area. I know it's a younger population than Miami is. I don't know that there's as heavily a concentration of New Yorkers there as there is in Miami. But when I used to go to Florida, I definitely would see more people wearing Yankee hats than Marlins hats.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, it happens in other places too, right? Phoenix. I know when the Cardinals play in Phoenix, I know there's a ton of Cardinal fans there in the stadiums.
Probably more Cubs fans in Phoenix than Diamondbacks, except for when they're winning.
You may remember that map Facebook created a few years back where they asked people what their favorite baseball team was,
mm-hmm.
and they organized it by zip code. And I think the saddest thing was that there wasn't a single zip code where the Mets were the favorite team. The Yankees even beat them in the zip codes that were right around their stadium.
Yeah, the other one that didn't do very well by that study was the Chicago White Sox. The White Sox had Indiana to thank because that was the only place where they had.
Well, I guess I hadn't thought about Salt Lake at all, but I've never had the impression when I was in Salt Lake that it was a baseball place. Do they even have? Is there a minor league team there now? I don't even know.
I think there is.
I know there at least used to be.
Yeah.
And they did just get a hockey team recently. I think what you're starting to see with San Francisco or with Salt Lake City rather, is what's happening with Vegas. I think you're seeing a push Will they get a major league team? I don't know, but I think they're going to throw their hat in the ring. I think they're starting to think that they're a big league city now, not just for basketball.
They just have to find out a name for the new hockey team. And we know it's not going to be Coyotes.
Well, given that they have had the Jazz for 30 years, 40 years now, and haven't renamed them when they moved to New Orleans, I don't know what they're going to do.
Yeah.
Is that the most inappropriate name for any team in sports?
No, the Lakers is worse.
Well, yeah, that
Well, that made sense when
those
they were in
two.
Minneapolis.
Yeah,
Yeah.
those two.
I
I mean, I'm
remember
not a Jazz fan, but when I think of cities, Jazz cities, Salt Lake City doesn't come quickly to mind.
The Salt Lake Mormon
Stiff white-
Tabernacle Choir team.
Yeah, stiff white people music is more their style. I think.
Yeah.
I remember the Jazz used to play like a third of their games in Las Vegas or something, right? Is there any possibility that an expansion team might split between cities, like San Antonio and Austin, or something like that? Or
Probably not. The cost of a stadium is so, once you have that investment, you need to have 81 games there to pay it off. And
Yeah.
yeah,
The Union won't go for it.
yeah, the Union didn't like the Expos going to Puerto Rico, right, for so many games. The players
Or-
hated it.
Or splitting Tampa Bay's season with Montreal.
Yeah. So,
I wouldn't want to have to maintain two homes, although for what they're making, they probably could afford to.
well, they could, but it's like being on the road for home games, right? I mean,
Right.
players hated it, I know, when they had to go to Puerto Rico. And so I just don't see that ever happening.
I'm sure
This-
Oklahoma City is an outsider, and but it's
This one, this has nothing to do with expansion baseball, but in my grave hunting, there are certain cities that seem to have a whole lot more people buried in that area, which tends to make me think the players who played there really liked it. So after they quit playing, they stayed there. St. Louis is one. Now the fact that they had two teams certainly increases their chances. What cities? I mean, there are a lot in the New York area, but what cities seem to be for the players the most pleasant places to live and play? Anybody familiar with players talking about that sort of thing?
Yeah, Florida and Arizona because taxes are low.
I know the umpires all live around the Phoenix area. They've got like clubs and special restaurants and things. It's like a
Really?
society down there. Yeah, that's where they almost all live. I think a lot of
Oh.
players live in Texas in the off season, but I don't for the same reason, no income taxes and warm
Mhm.
weather.
And so people that don't play for Toronto aren't going to live up there.
Well, there have been very few, if any, players who have lived here when they were playing. There's one guy in the early years, Rick Bassetti, lived year round in Toronto, and then he got traded to Oakland and he moved back to California. But there's really between the weather and the taxation, there's really no advantage of a player living here if they don't have to.
I think Gosman has lived here, and Malter lived here in the 90s.
Who?
And Paul Malter lived here in the 90s.
Paul Molitor did live here in the 90s. You're right.
And I think Kevin Gosman, as I said, has lived here in Toronto. That's why I've heard that.
And I don't want that to sound like I'm knocking Toronto. I've been there once and I liked it. It seemed like a very, very pleasant place. I just thought it was funny that people were using their air conditioning and complaining about the heat when it was 72 degrees.
No, it's more because of the weather and the tax system that players wouldn't live here.
Okay.
I guess I would ask Fred because he would know the answer to this. Probably is how many do players tend to be buried where they grew up or where they retired to or where they played, or is there a pattern?
I do see a lot of guys who born in St. Louis, died in St. Louis, buried in St. Louis. Although I had one the other day, born in Texas, died in Texas, buried in Cleveland. But that's because that's where his wife was from. And so he's buried in the cemetery where his wife's family's buried. My favorite related trivia question: who was the Red Sox franchise home run leader before Babe Ruth? Or maybe the one who, I'm sorry, I think it's the one who broke Babe Ruth's record before Jimmy Fox came along, was Phil Tott, assuming that's the right way to pronounce it, T-O-D-T. But he was buried in the exact same place that he was born because his father was the groundskeeper for St. Peter and Paul Cemetery in St. Louis. And he was born in the groundskeeper's home in the cemetery. And he is also buried there. So that's not exactly what you're asking.
Maxwell is also wondering in relation to the burying thing, because this would be like, can you think offhand of many expansion players who like fell in love with their new city and settled in there and then maybe were buried there as well? I can't think of any offhand, but I'm sure there are some.
I'm sure it's happened.
Yeah, I mean, one issue though is the expansion is relatively recent, so you don't have a real large sample size there.
Doesn't Randy Johnson live in Arizona?
I don't know if he moved back to California or if he still lives in Arizona. Just trying to think about that. Well, Bob Aspermonte has lived ever since the Astros picked him in the expansion draft. He's lived in Houston his whole life. He bought a Coors distillery after he retired, and he brought his brother Ken down from Brooklyn to work there. So they're both living and work. Well, they're long retired now, but they were both living and working in Houston, even though they were born in Brooklyn, New York.
I know it wasn't an expansion player, but I was just surprised that it wasn't until 10 years ago, and I'm almost 60 now, I found out there was a Hall of Fame player in Winfield, Kansas, Fred Clark, buried there.
Mm-hmm.
He was in Pittsburgh and then moved to Winfield, and I guess liked the area and farmed around there, and he's buried there, and I didn't even learn about it till about 10 years ago.
I'm going to jump in. Does anyone, we're approaching sort of the end of our time to have this. Does anyone have any more questions for Maxwell? And then I figure we can wrap up with some chapter business.
Just thank you for the great presentation.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, absolutely. This was great. Thank you so much, Maxwell.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
All right.
Okay, bye.
All right, guys. Thank you so much for coming on. This was really good. As an expansion baseball nerd, I thoroughly enjoyed it. I will be getting the notes updated on this and added to the annual report that I have to submit to SABR later. I anticipate having our next meeting probably around the time the season ends, late October, early November. So be on the lookout for that. I've received multiple great suggestions, and I always keep a running list. So if anyone has any suggestions, feel free to shoot them my way. Otherwise, I will stay in touch on a regular basis, trying to plan our next one. But for the time being, I will go ahead and give you guys your Saturday afternoons back. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll catch you next time.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.